Greetings, everyone. I want to welcome you here today for another daily devotion. We're going through the book of Matthew together, and today's verses are taken from Matthew 26, verses 51 through 56. I want to go ahead and read our passage of those verses together. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he'll at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be filled that it must be so?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. Okay, so we're here at the arrest of Jesus. He's been betrayed by Judas, accompanied by a large crowd, and the religious leaders have showed up with clubs to arrest him. So in defense of his Lord, we have one of Jesus' disciples taking out a sword and cutting off the servant of the high priest's ear. First, from John's gospel, we know this disciple was Peter, who often would spring into action before thinking things all the way through. I think we can call Peter's behavior honest impetuosity. Second, we see that Jesus rebukes him for it. He said, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I can't appeal to my Father, and he'll at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" So we also know from John's gospel account that Jesus healed the man's ear, and it appears not to have had any spiritual effect on the crowd as a whole. After all, they still followed suit to arrest Jesus. So Jesus' rebuke of Peter really begs the question for me, is Jesus teaching pacifism here by rebuking Peter? Well, the short answer is no. For in Luke 22:36, Jesus had told his disciples, "If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." So Jesus knew that this particular time was not the time for them to uphold their right to self-defense. So why did Peter get rebuked here? Well, because in his zeal to defend the Lord, Peter was actually stepping in front of God's will here. Jesus had told his disciples multiple times that he must be arrested, put on trial, and die. So in other words, Peter acted unwisely in this situation. The Lord doesn't need anyone to defend him. He's the Lord. He could have smote them with a word. And in addition to that, he has a multitude of heavenly angels at his disposal. All that to say, we need wisdom to know when to fight and when not to. In fact, the Bible actually never forbids self-defense, and believers are allowed to defend themselves and their families according to Exodus 22:2-3, but it does give parameters on it. However, the fact that we're permitted to defend ourselves does not always necessarily mean that we have to in every situation. There may be times we're called to absorb insults or threats and even martyrdom if that's necessary. Knowing God's heart through reading his word and relying on his wisdom will help us know whether a situation calls for self-defense or defending others or not. So Jesus rebukes Peter again, not for having a sword, but simply for standing in the way of God's will here. It was God's will that Jesus be arrested, tried, and killed according to his testimony and that of Zechariah 13:7, which says, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. I turn my hand against the little ones." So they continue in the act of arresting Jesus. His disciples flee, leaving Jesus, and they scatter. So quick to defend him on one hand, and yet so quick to flee him on the other. Can't we be just like that sometimes? So quick to boast of the Lord and all the good he does in our lives and saving and redeeming us and blessing us with all the spiritual blessings. But then in a moment of trial or temptation, we turn things to things other than him for comfort. We flee, not only Jesus, but also the fellowship of his people sometimes. Do you know that according to the statistics, the pandemic has had a negative effect on church attendance? In fact, it's argued that 1/3 of all Americans who attended religious services regularly do now less after the pandemic. So in moments of doubt, depression, anxiety, fear, despair, panic, we need to cling to the Lord and the fellowship of his people all the more. And in good times, we need the Lord and his people no less. I want to encourage you, if you're one of those watching who's pulled away from the local gathering of the church and have settled for online options, get back to the local gathering of the church. Jesus would not have purchased the church with his own precious blood if the church was not absolutely necessary for the Christian. God has shown us so much grace. How many of you would like more of that grace? Well, the local church gathering is where we partake in the means of grace that God uses to give more grace to Christians, some of which include the teaching of the word, baptisms, the Lord's Supper, prayer for one another, worship, church discipline, giving, spiritual gifts, fellowship, evangelism, personal ministry to others in need. Needless to say, there's a lot more to lose by not being present in a local gathering of the church because it's where God provides even more grace. So if you're in that 1/3 of those who's reduced their attendance, I urge you to get back to the local gathering and partake once again in the means of grace that God provides in it. God bless you this week, and we look forward to seeing you in this week's church service on Sunday morning. God bless you guys.